All right, welcome into FreeThinking Ministries, where we seek to help people reason together by applying logic and sound theology to all aspects of life. I am Josh Klein, and today, Tim, we are going to dissect Molinism. You've written a thing or two about this topic. But we're not going to do it ourselves.
I'm more interested in Molinism right now.
Yeah, I like that. Molinism, whatever it is. So, Tim, you may have written a book on this topic, but today we're going to get into the weeds and ask, well, maybe which flavor of Molinism is the best type or something like that.
Right. Well, I always like talking about the different flavors of Molinism because Molinists don't always agree. And in fact, I have some views as a Molinist that I think, in fact, I know that many of the other Molinists don't quite hold, and that's where the fun is. I love getting together with other Molinists and arguing about these things and seeing how we might see Molinism differently than the other. And that's just fun. That's where the iron sharpens iron. And I just love talking to theologians that think differently about all aspects of theology. But man, when it's about Molinism, middle knowledge, human free will, and God's sovereignty and things like that, nothing gets me more excited. And so the guys that we're going to have on today are just two of the best when it comes to this topic. And so I'm really, really excited for today's episode.
Yeah, so we could call this the Molinism Hypecast because we are hyped to talk about Molinism. If you are hyped as well, make sure you like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel. Today, we're going to be joined by two very significant voices, other than yours, of course, Tim. I got to always pat the ego a little bit in the realm of Molinism. I'm going to bring them on the stage here in just a little bit. It's going to be a little bit of an in-depth podcast. So if you're following along, you got to get your thinking caps on for this one. We've got a lot to get to today, and hopefully we can get to all of it. If not, maybe we can have them back on. But first, we'll bring on our guests. Tyson James, you were here last week with us, and Dr. Ryan Mullins. Tyson. Yeah. For those who don't know, Tyson, who was here last week as we dissected Alex O'Connor and William Lane Craig's discussion, you can check that out in the most recent podcast. Tyson works with Reasonable Faith and founded Sound Faith Consulting and is the president of that. And Dr. Ryan Mullins has been the author of several books and journal articles and is the host of the Reluctant Theologian podcast, which has some of the best music in the podcast industry, I must say. So welcome, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Definitely the best music in the theology podcast industry.
Yeah.
Well, the bar is pretty low for that, though. So I mean,
that's true. That's true.
Fair enough.
I'm glad you're raising the standard, though, for all of us.
I try. Yeah.
Yes. And oh man, do you not have your nails painted today?
I don't, because they were chipped. They looked really terrible, so I had to get rid of them the other day. And yeah, haven't painted them.
I am disappointed. I mean, last time you were on the show, I think you were rocking the black nails.
Most likely, yeah.
You had the metal thing going, which I really appreciate. I got to tell you.
Yeah. So anybody who says philosophers can't be metal, they don't know what they're talking about.
No.
Yeah. All right. Dr. Mullins, you had a podcast, last week?
I guess it was released last week. I recorded these things in November for a PhD seminar that I was leading in Switzerland. But I think that the episode was released last week.
Okay. Yeah. And it's on Molinism. And as our viewers will know, that is something that Dr. Stratton, I've known you for how long, and I just mispronounced your name, holds near and dear to his heart. He may have written a book on the topic. So we thought, this would be a good discussion. A lot to get to. Go ahead.
Yeah. And whenever I have an opportunity to have a quick conversation with Ryan, I always take it. I always look forward to seeing him every November at the EPS. And we're looking forward to this next one in Denver. I know we're both going to be there. But I actually reached out to Ryan to have him look over some of the things I was saying in the second edition of Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism. And really helped me out there. And you'll see him cited throughout several parts of the book. So Ryan, thank you for that. And I really appreciate some of the different nuances you bring, especially to the time, the arguments and the conversation about time and time theory. It's really helped me. And I think it provides some clarity and helps people to, we'll probably talk about this today a little bit, so I won't jump ahead too much, but I really appreciate what you've brought to the table. You challenge people in how they're thinking and how they're speaking, and you've done you do that. You cause waves, but in a good way. And so let's make some waves today.
I hope they're good. I mean, some people get really angry, but that's just the nature of philosophy and theology.
Right.
People don't realize that, when you tell people that you're discussing philosophy, they're like, "Oh, that's so dry and boring," and be like, "You haven't been to some of the discussions I've been in."
Yeah. Some of the drama behind the scenes or all in front of the scenes, you know.
Yeah. And Tyson, you just moved to the East Coast from Las Vegas, and you can see his studio is still in the works, right?
It's in process.
Yeah. As you can tell, I'm using my laptop potato camera to record with you guys today. But yeah, we just moved to Virginia. I'm enjoying the greenery around here, and it's good to be with you guys. I'm going to jump on the Mullins compliment train. I've known Ryan for many years. He's a very dear friend of mine. I do have to say, I think he is one of the sharpest philosopher theologians out there right now. His work is going to be a benefit to the church at large, and really to Christian philosophy and theology in general for many, many years to come. And so I hope that if you're out there, you're not familiar with his work, you will pick up some books of his, download his podcast. Yeah, absolutely. Because he dives very deeply into these subjects, really pulling out the historical threads of every concept that he covers. He has on fantastic guests sometimes, and really every episode is just a gold mine. So check out his work.
Yeah.
Amen.
So that's the Reluctant Theologians podcast, and that's the podcast we're discussing today. It's about 30 minutes long, focused on Molinism, talked about Molinism's strengths, some of the objections, and a little bit of a thought on Dr. Craig's seemingly incoherent version of Molinism. I'm sure we'll have a little bit of a discussion about that. But first, let's jump into the discussion as we revisit some of Molinism's strengths, and we'll visit a few other aspects before we tackle your critique of Craig, which I'm sure we'll spend a decent amount of time in. So where do you find, Dr. Mullins, it's going to be difficult to say Mullins and Molinism over and over.
It is, yeah. It really is tricky.
Yeah. Where do you find the strengths in Molinism?
So if the view is coherent, it's supposed to give you this nice account of divine sovereignty without any sort of risks, and with this like really robust account of divine freedom, or with human freedom. And so that's supposed to be the main strength. So if you're an open theist, a lot of open theists will say, well, God doesn't know the future. He doesn't know exactly how history is going to unfold. And he gave humanity this really amazing kind of freedom. And because of that, there are certain risks that are going to take place. God might not get everything he wants. Or there might be a lot of really horrible stuff that happens along the way that God didn't account for. Or maybe he did account for it, but there's still going to be a lot of like kind of suffering that takes place along the way that God is not trying to meticulously arrange things where you get a greater good out of every single thing that happens. And so that kind of risk, those different kinds of risks that might be involved there, Molinists go, we don't have any risk there. God definitely gets what he wants. Maybe not every single thing that happens in history is connected to a greater good. Molinists disagree on these things. Some say, yeah, it definitely is. Others are like, nah, it's just what happens when you give creatures free will. But God knew in advance that's how it was going to go. But any sort of risk of God's providential plan just kind of falling apart, that's not on the table for the Molinist. And if you're a theological determinist, you'll definitely say there's no risk involved with God's plan getting screwed up. But there's others. Yeah, exactly. You get some other problems. Like, how do you really have human free will? They'll say, yeah, there's some kind of freedom there. Molinists go, no, I don't know what you guys are talking about. This sounds a bit silly to me. Or you're using some weird euphemisms to just really say, yeah, we don't actually have free will. Like there's a lot of things that might happen. And of course, determinists have lots of fancy footwork they can do to respond to those things. But the Molinist claim is, I've got risk-free sovereignty, so haha, better than you, open theist. And I've got this actual account of free will, so haha, better than you, theological determinist. And so these are supposed to be some of the kind of strengths that you'll see.
Yeah, well, just to add to that, as a Molinist, and having edited the second edition of Tim's book, and worked with Dr. Craig, those are definitely strengths of Molinism, what Ryan just mentioned, but also the application and explanatory power of Molinism extends far beyond that. So you've got these other issues of like explaining certain biblical truths, like the inspiration of Scripture. How can it be both the writing of God and man at the same time? You've got, explanations for the problem of evil, the problem of the unevangelized. All of these different issues that seem to pop up over and over seem to be very easily explained if Molinism is true. And so that kind of gives us a motivation to figure out, is this true? And if so, man, it seems like we have a lot of resources to very easily explain certain things that we want to hold true as Christians.
Amen. And I would just say I definitely agree with both Ryan and Tyson there. This is exactly why Molinism has been so attractive to many philosophers and theologians, because it preserves a robust divine providence and genuine human libertarian freedom. And in my own work, I've even applied it and taken it further and said things. I'll say it like this: for all we know, God created the one feasible, freedom-permitting world in which evil is ultimately defeated, and all who are not trans-world damned are saved. And so that even leaves room for hopeful universalism without requiring universalism. So I can, even though I don't think universalism is probably true, I point out that, hey, this at least, I say that Molinism makes room and is the best model to have a reasonable hope for universalism that would solve a lot of problem of evil questions. I do think that Molinism, at the end of the day, is the only view that can really answer all the objections raised against the knowledge of God underneath the umbrella of the problem of evil. I think Calvinism or theological determinism faces horrible problems. And I think there's pretty big problems that come along with open theism as well when it comes to the problem of evil. So, yeah, as Tyson was mentioning, the explanatory power that comes along with Molinism, it's just overwhelming. And, with what Ryan said, if it's coherent, it answers all of this. And so, yeah, that's why I've spent so much time trying to say, this is why it's coherent. This is why it makes sense of both philosophical issues and the biblical data. So, yeah, I'm hoping it stands strong at the end of the day.
Yeah. So obviously there are some objections that people raise against Molinism, obviously, as with everything. One of those objections has to do with what is called the grounding objection. Mm-hmm. How do we ground these? How do we ground God's knowledge? How do we ground these things? And some of that has to do with what we call truth maker theory. And you touched on this a little bit in your podcast, but I want to dive in a little bit as well. First of all, can we explain that briefly for those who didn't hear your podcast? And then how does Molinism handle that? And does it seem like points in favor of it, or is it pretty even across the board as far as grounding these truths?
Mm-hmm. So you want me to explain truth maker first?
Yeah, just quickly, just in 30 seconds.
So the claim, the standard story of truth making says that all truths need an existing truth maker. And a truth maker is some sort of entity that actually exists that necessitates the truth of the proposition in question. So if you think about a truth like Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States, if you're affirming the truth maker theory that I just laid out, the standard view, you've got to find some some entity that exists that you can point to and go, that's the thing that necessitates the truth of this. The truth makers they have to be these metaphysically complex things, like a substance plus its tropes, or or others will say it's got to be this concrete state of affairs, which is you plus your properties plus there's like all this other stuff. There's a lot of metaphysics get shoved into this, which is kind of odd, because it sounds like you're just saying, like, there's something out there that makes it true. That's it. And then turns out actually you got to do a lot of metaphysics. You got to shove down someone's throat to make something true. So that's the truth maker theory. So the objection for the Molinist is, okay, you guys say prior to creation, God's like, what do I want to create? Well, there's all these hypotheticals or counterfactuals or whatever you want to call them, where it's like, if Ryan were in this situation, this is what Ryan would do. And the grounding objection against Molinism goes, okay, well, you need a truth maker. Well, Ryan doesn't exist. So like, what are you pointing to? What's the thing that makes this true? So that's the problem.
In your view, and then any of you three can jump in here. Tim, I think this was Dr. White's main objection to Molinism, seemed to be the grounding objection, if it serves me right.
Yeah.
But it seems like truth maker theory is it is not. It doesn't need to be as widely accepted as some people claim it is. It's got its own problems, as you've said. So you three can jump in with Tim. First of all, why don't you talk about? I mean, that was White's issue, right?
Yeah, in our debate several years ago, I think that would be his at least one of his big objections to this kind of knowledge. It's to middle knowledge. But if you even think about, if you say that God, there has to be this concrete state of affairs that exists to ground these truths, then that's going to be a problem for anybody that advances the fine-tuning argument for God's existence, because there's nothing that actually exists. Just gravity doesn't exist. The force of gravity doesn't exist. So how is God going to know if the force of gravity is weaker in the initial conditions of the universe? Then the universe would expand too rapidly for stars and planets to form, let alone human bodies. And so I think that anybody that affirms the fine-tuning argument, unless you're going to be a Mormon and say, well, the matter just already existed, so God would, but then they're going to have a problem with God existing. Anyway, most Christians are going to say, no, God had this knowledge prior to creation about stuff that doesn't exist, right? About this concrete stuff, that matter and the laws of nature and everything else. And so if God can have knowledge of that without it corresponding to anything in reality, why can't he know counterfactuals of how humans would freely choose as well?
Yeah. And could it work the same way with things that don't exist, like unicorns or Santa Claus? We know that they don't exist. How is that grounded in?
Well, yeah, those are definitely problems for, and Ryan, I think you talked about the unicorns in your podcast.
Yeah, so this is a standard objection to the truth maker story that I laid out a minute ago, because I said you have to find actually existing things that make true the propositions. Well, there's no unicorns, so like, what do I point towards to be like, well, there's no unicorns? Like I point to like a bunch of like non-existent stuff. Like so this is quite a serious problem, and so a common move is to go. I either do a bunch of fancy metaphysical footwork, or I go, let's just restrict the project of truth making to something a little bit smaller domain. And you're like, why would I do that? You're like, well, because I can't handle these problems otherwise. So you start restricting it in order to deal with certain objections, which might look a little bit ad hoc, is the way sometimes the objection goes.
Right. And I love the example that you gave. Suppose that we exist in a four-dimensional time block, right? And then God annihilates it or just erases all of creation. Wouldn't it still be true that the four of us recorded a podcast, even though none of us exist? Right. Yeah.
So John Leslie and then Patrick Todd, who's an open theist, so they both give this example of like, imagine like the entire block of time, or if you don't like that sort of stuff, because Patrick Todd doesn't like it, just say the universe is just gone. You just get rid of the universe.
Yeah.
well, surely it's still true that the universe existed. There's no like thing that I can point towards that like currently exists to make it true, but surely that's just the way truth works, is that once something's true, like it's just true.
Yeah.
Like,
Uh-huh.
but the truth maker, the standard account of truth making can't account for this. You have to make restrictions to the scope of truth maker theory to accommodate this, and that's a controversial move to make.
Mm-hmm. And even if you make restrictions that would seem to favor the Molinist, to say, well, if you're going to make restrictions there, why can't we just make restrictions here?
Correct. And so this is why Jonathan Talent wants to reject the entire truth-making project, because he says, look, first off, you tell me there's this really standard, like intuitive, super intuitive thing called truth maker. And it's this royal road to truth. It's this metaphysically neutral position that forces you to make all sorts of really crazy metaphysical moves, like concrete states of affairs and stuff like this. He's like, okay, that doesn't sound like a royal road to truth. Now, in order to solve these problems, you restrict and you restrict and you restrict. And you're like, well, what's left? Why am I affirming this view? And you're like, well, I need truth maker to catch cheaters. This was a statement that was made a lot in metaphysics about a decade or so ago. And cheating just means basically just, I don't like what you said, so you must be cheating. And then I try to hit you with truth maker. And so Talent's just kind of poking holes in all of these things. And he's like, look, why this isn't intuitive. It doesn't really make any sense anymore. It's incredibly ad hoc now because you've like restricted like, the heck out of this thing. Why should I affirm truth maker anymore? And this is completely unrelated to like theological concerns in his mind. Because yeah, you could always just posit something to serve as a truth maker if you really want. And so it doesn't help with the whole like, oh, you're cheating. You're like, I can posit whatever I want to make truth, to make my truths, like, what do you want? So it gets weird. And so that's why Talent says, like, just get rid of truth maker theory. Just let's do something else.
Yeah, so a few things. First, he mentioned in his podcast Trenton Merrick's and his problems with truth maker theory. I do highly recommend that if you're interested in this subject, check out Truth and Ontology. It's a fantastic book. Really kind of, I think, lays to rest this idea that every truth needs a concrete truth maker. Also, you mentioned the debate with Tim and James White. Going back to James White, he also had that debate with Dr. Craig, I think, on the Unbelievable podcast. Yeah. And I, after reviewing that, White tried to bring up the grounding objection. And part of the problem is that there are different formulations of the grounding objection. And so, you have to really seriously and concisely articulate what it is that you're trying to push forward in that objection. And then you have to show that there are no plausible solutions that have been offered or that all of those solutions fail. And White clearly had not read any of the literature on this at all. He wasn't familiar with what exactly the grounding objection was or what it implies or why it's a problem for the Molinists. I think he just saw a lot of people putting it forward and decided, hey, I'm going to just say that there's a grounding objection.
If memory serves, Tyson, didn't Dr. White, when he was going back and forth with you and I before the debate, the two of us would make some video response responding to White, and we would go back and forth for a while. And if memory serves, didn't he say at one point that God determines the truth value to all propositions?
Yeah.
And then, and so then we pushed on him and like, oh, did he determine the truth value that God exists necessarily, or that God exists as a Trinity and things like that?
Yeah, he really didn't understand the implications of what he said. And I think later on, he was told, like, this is really problematic. If God has to determine the truth value of every proposition, then he had to determine the truth value of the proposition that he exists, which means he would have to exist prior to that being true. It's like really, really problematic stuff that happens when, you're kind of philosophically inept and look down on philosophy and then try to argue, against philosophical positions. But yeah, just kind of moving forward a little bit. So you mentioned there are no unicorns example for, a statement that's true without there plausibly being a truth maker for it. And there are a bunch of other examples of this problem, like, plausibly true statements that don't have truth makers. So like, for instance, all ravens are black, right? So sure, it may be the case that all ravens that exist today are black, but that doesn't entail all ravens whatsoever, right? There are past ravens that are included in all ravens, and future ravens, right? So how can the past and future ravens, which don't exist anymore or don't exist yet, be part of the truth maker of all ravens are black, right? That doesn't make sense on truth maker theory. Also, the statement torturing a child is wrong, right? That is a true statement, but that doesn't imply that there are any children. That could be true even if there are no children at all, or there are existing children that aren't being tortured, right? So again, you've got all these different statements that are plausibly true that don't really seem to have any sort of existing concrete truth makers.
I want to thank Ryan again here, because as Ryan was looking over some of the manuscript of the Mere Molinism book, he encouraged me to make sure I put this in here, that just say, hey, we just can reject this truth maker maximalism here, and he's exactly right. And I thanked you in a footnote, cited you there, and you know, I want people to hear this. There's simply no obligation for us to accept this truth maker maximalism, and as Ryan's pointed out here, right, as Ryan and Tyson have both explained here, if there's any obligation, if we're going to say there's an obligation to believe one, well, we need to, what reasons do we have reason to accept truth maker maximalism? No. Do we have reason to reject it? I'd say yes. And so if there is an obligation, it's to reject truth maker maximalism. But the other side will constantly tell us that they want us to believe that there's an obligation to accept truth maker maximalism. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah. So I think my friend Alan Rhoda, so he's an open theist, and he's done a lot of really interesting work on providence and trying to work these issues out, from an open theist perspective. And he wants to affirm truth maker maximalism because he thinks he can do really put God to work in his metaphysics. Because a lot of Christian philosophers don't. God's kind of there in your metaphysics, but not really doing anything. Whereas Rhoda is like, no, let's put God to work. He's stop being a lazy bum. Like make him, he's got to get a job in our ontology. And he thinks he can really do a lot to make God the source of a lot of truth makers for things like negative existentials, like there are new unicorns, or things like necessary truths, like the ones that Tyson was pointing out. And so Rhoda's going to say, I've got really good reasons for affirming truth maker maximalism. None of this like restricted nonsense. Like I can give you the full thing. Mm-hmm. And so he's got some arguments, so you need to consider those. Whereas a lot of other people just kind of lazily go, it's just super intuitive, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they just they assert the well, since it makes sense to me, and I said it. It must be true.
Yeah.
I would also add, too, that it's not necessarily the case that all Molinists reject truth maker theory, right? So there are Molinists that accept truth maker theory, and they've tried to provide truth makers for the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, right? Mm-hmm. So, for instance, Kirk McGregor, he points to divine super comprehension, which is this idea that God knows his own mind, right? And his own mind includes concepts of creaturely essences, all the creatures that he could possibly create. And in virtue of knowing his own mind, therefore knows what each of these creatures would freely do in any given situation. So that is one avenue. So it's not necessary for Molinists to reject truth maker theory. And I think it's a strength that we have accounts of Molinism that work on accepting or rejecting truth maker theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You bring up Kirk McGregor here. That's someone that you brought up in your podcast in talking about this next topic. When we were, so as we move on to foreknowledge and freedom.
If I know what I'm going to do in the future, I have no free will. If someone else knows, no big deal. And then you apply that to God. God doesn't know what he himself is going to do prior to his decree to create a universe and anything. So yeah, it's fine. But if he did, though, oh gosh, God wouldn't have free will. So it's a good thing that God, prior to decreeing, doesn't know what he himself is going to do. That's supposed to be the kind of claim.
Yeah. So what? Let's get into that. Is it, first of all, is it true? Like or not true? Is that necessarily true? Where if you know, I think you have a good answer to this in your podcast. If you know what you're going to do, that you're not free, or if someone else knows what you're going to do, that you're not free. Is that true? Do we even need to accept that premise? And secondly, how does that apply to God and Molinism?
So let me answer the second question first, so then you can see, like, I think more what's going on here. So this is the biggest problem I have with Molinism that I don't know how to sort out in my own head. Is you've got this freedom foreknowledge problem, and so the common claim is like, oh, if God knows what you're going to do in the future, oh yeah, how are you going to have free will? What are you going to do? And sometimes the way the conversations go, it does say like, yeah, if someone knows what you're going to do, you're not free. So God better like not tell you what's going to happen, otherwise he's going to undermine your free will. And I'm like, surely that's not right. Surely the problem is not just about someone telling me, but it's the fact that there's already truths about what I will do. The history of what I will do has already been written, and that seems to me to be the real problem for my free will. And when you're looking at Molinism, that's where, at least to me, it seems like Molina kind of sees like, oh gosh, yeah, that's the real problem. Because when he's talking about God prior to creation, he says before God decides to do anything at all, like there just is no fact of the matter about what God will do. Will God create or not create? There's no fact of the matter because God hasn't decided. Will God create this universe or that? He hasn't made a decision yet. Stop it. There's no fact of the matter. And if there was, well, then God would not have free will. And I'm like, why is it a problem? Like, so it seems like you're admitting that the problem here for freedom is if there are truths about what you will do, and who knows it and who doesn't know it is just kind of a distraction, in my opinion.
Almost like a semantic distraction.
I don't know if it's a semantic distraction, because I remember one time, like Linda Zagzebski, she was presenting on this, and she was just like, yeah, here's all these truths. It's just about what you're going to do. But, you know, if someone knows it and someone infallibly knows it, then like it's a real problem. I'm like, that's not the problem. Like the problem is like, there's just a story of what I'm going to do, and I haven't done anything yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see how, I just think it's unnecessary to say like, well, if someone knows it, therefore I'm like, I don't see that's an extra problem.
So you don't think, okay, Ryan, that if somebody knows it, then that means that you can't be free in a libertarian sense?
Yeah, I don't think the mere knowledge is really the problem. I think the real problem would be like the truths. Because if you say like, well, it doesn't matter that someone knows, it matters that like they infallibly know it. I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna eat a cheeseburger later. Okay, it's just true. It's just been true since the dawn of time that I'm gonna do that. Well, now someone infallibly knows it. I'm like, and like it's still just true.
Yeah, but that doesn't determine you. I mean, so a truth or a fact, if these things actually exist, would be abstract objects, and those would be how does Dr. Craig say it? Causally effete.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And
no, you're exactly right. Because what the issue here is, there's a question about why exactly is that true, and so we need some kind of story to tell where it doesn't undermine your freedom. But what it looks like is Molina is aware that, oh gosh, I need to tell some kind of story, otherwise God's not free. I don't know what that story is, so I'll just say prior to creation, there just are no truths about what God's going to do.
Right. Okay. So I mean, it seems to me that even if we were to grant, for the sake of argument, that God couldn't have chosen otherwise, God is still not being causally determined by something or someone else. He would still have sourcehood libertarian freedom, wouldn't he?
Yeah, he'd have sourcehood. I don't know if that's enough. It depends on, it depends on a few things. So the standard account of creation ex nihilo was coupled with this account of freedom, where God is free to create or not create, and free to create a different universe from the one we have. And this has to do with like a lot of stuff going on in the first few centuries that were contrasting with the science of the day, which was this kind of Neoplatonism. And so by the time you get to Molina, there's been a lot of controversies that have taken place. A lot of people got condemned, or maybe like your job was threatened if you affirmed that God had to create and that God didn't have any options. So Molina, he's like, yeah, God's got options. In fact, I've got a great story to tell you about how God's got like loads of options. And so like this is kind of what Molina's up to. So I think if you just said, well, just mere sourcehood, my guess is Molina would be like, well, I'm not allowed to say that in Paris. I'll get condemned, like thankfully, I'll hang out over here. Like that's my guess is what would happen.
So
this always seems to be like the sticking point between open theists and Molinists. This is the real tension. We get these comments all the time on our own channel when we talk about Molinism and that sort of thing, but they always focus on God's knowledge, not on the fact that these truths just already exist. You're saying that they maybe have that backwards, where it doesn't matter if God knows it or not. It's actually backwards. Do these truths exist or not?
Yes.
And if they do exist,
and if they do exist, do they create a problem here? Because what it looks like Molina is doing is admitting it's a problem in the case of humans. I'm sorry, it's a problem in the case of God, but it's not a problem in the case of humans. And I want to know, why is it a problem in the case of God, but not a problem in the case of humans?
If God told us what we would do. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, just if there were truths prior to your existence and prior to your decisions.
He's saying the knowledge is a distraction from the
exactly. I don't think the knowledge matters. I think what matters is,
are there
before
truths?
God decides, am I going to create or not? Is there a fact of the matter that God will create? And then Molina's like, no, because then God wouldn't be free. And I'm like, oh, okay. But before I perform any actions, there's a fact of what I'm going to do, and that's not a problem.
So that brings up something I want to get to, but first I want to give it to Tyson. Do you have anything you'd like to say to that?
Yeah, so Ryan and I were talking offline yesterday about this. He had a really good line. He said, this problem, this saying that if God foreknows his own counterfactuals of freedom, then, it removes his free will, but not, if he knows creaturely counterfactuals of freedom. It seems like, open theism for God, but not for humans, right? Because there's just no fact of the matter for God, but there is a fact of the matter for humans. So why the difference there? And I think there is a huge problem here. And I'm going to actually agree with Ryan that if God knew his own counterfactuals of freedom, that it wouldn't actually remove his freedom, because counterfactuals of freedom entail that he knows something about what he would freely do. Right. So that's just built into the definition. And even for ourselves, I think if we knew that we would freely do something tomorrow, I don't think it would remove our freedom, because we would still freely do that. So even Dr. Craig, who does agree with Molina on this, even Dr. Craig says that knowledge is not causal. Right. So even if you foreknow something, it doesn't actually affect the causal story, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about free will, right? It's a causal account of choosing. So if knowledge doesn't affect the causal account, then there's no way that it could impede free will one way or the other. But I think there is a major problem that arises if God knows his own counterfactuals of freedom. And namely, I think it leads to fatalism. So what happens is you have this counterfactual of divine freedom, like the statement, if God were to exist, then he would freely actualize world B, say. Okay? This is true. Like, let's just postulate that this is true. Well, God exists necessarily, right? I mean, there's no way he can't, not exist. But that kind of implies that he has to create or actualize world B. Right? That's just, if he exists, he's going to create or actualize world B. There doesn't seem to be any other possibility, because that counterfactual is just true before God decides to do anything, right, on this account. So if he knows his own counterfactuals of freedom, and that includes what world he's going to actualize, then you don't really have any other choice. There's only one possible world. You can't say, oh, he could create world A or C or D, because he exists necessarily, and it's already true that he would actualize world B. So there you have fatalism. And so I think if he does know his own counterfactuals of freedom, you have fatalism.
So how would you define fatalism?
Yeah, fatalism doesn't have anything to do with the causal account of choosing. I think you can have free will in fatalism. Really, fatalism has to do with the logical necessity of what happens. So everything that happens of logical necessity. It has to happen. There can't be any other way that it happens. Right. That's the idea.
So if a truth Okay, so determinism. I like to define determinism as, or say an event is determined if antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate the event. Mm-hmm. And so then if we apply that to all things, and we have determinism, or to be redundant, exhaustive determinism. So you're not arguing, I mean, okay, so you're talking about fatalism, but then you say, when you're talking about necessity, but if libertarian freedom is compatible with fatalism, then it doesn't seem like things are happening via necessity.
Well, I mean, so that depends on whether or not you think alternative possibilities is necessary for free will. A lot of philosophers reject that now. So, we're talking about a causal account of free will, not necessarily how many options you have. So even if you have one option, you can freely choose that option.
Oh, I agree. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you don't need alternative possibilities in order for fatalism, or in order to have free will, libertarian free will. You just have to have one possibility, and that's consistent with fatalism. So let me just kind of continue with this, because I don't want to leave people, like thinking that this is like, there's no solution here. So I think if this is true that God, knows his own divine counterfactuals of freedom, then it leads to fatalism. But I think what Ryan's tension here is that Molinists want to reject that God knows his own divine counterfactuals, but he knows human counterfactuals, and his knowing them still allows them to be free, even though if God knew his own, he wouldn't be free. I've since conceded that, like, it's really a matter of fatalism, but we still want to get rid of fatalism, right? So why can we say that maybe God doesn't know his own counterfactuals, but he does know human counterfactuals of freedom? Here, I think I want to point to the fact that while we are similar to God in some ways, we're obviously different in other ways. And those differences are really important for this conversation. They will entail that certain categories of truths apply to us that don't apply to God, and vice versa. So certain categories apply to God that don't apply to us. So just for a few examples, truths about the consequences of our sins, right? There are truths about those consequences, but God certainly doesn't have any truths about the consequences of his sins, right? So that category only applies to us. Truths about what the world would be like without our existence, right? There are truths about that for us, but plausibly, there are no such truths about what the world would be like without God, because there just wouldn't be any worlds for there to be anything true if God did not exist.
Because he exists necessarily.
Right. So that's another category of truth that applies to us, but not God. Or truths about existing without the created order at all, right? We can't have truths like that apply to us because we can't exist without the created order. But of course, God can exist without the created order. So if there are truths about that, then they apply to God and not us. So there are certain categories of truths that apply to God, but not us, and certain categories that apply to us and not God. And here, I think we have a situation where the category of knowing counterfactuals of freedom applies to, God knows our counterfactuals, but he doesn't know his own. And I don't think that's a problem, because he exists necessarily and we do not. So there are truths about, the world that are contingent on our existence. We are contingent creatures. And so there are truths that aren't necessary, even if God knows them about us. But that wouldn't be the case if he knew them about himself.
Ryan, how do you feel about that?
I was just going to ask.
Because I can see in a lot of these examples what the relevant difference is. So the sin one's really good, because you could say, well, God's essentially perfectly good. So sin, like that's just not going to apply. So I can see what the explanation is for why certain truths about God are going to be the case, and they're going to be different from humans. What I'm missing is why it's not a problem for me that there's a bunch of truths about what I will do, and I still have free will, but it is a problem about God if there's a bunch of truths about him before he makes a decision. I just don't know what the relevant difference is in this particular case. The other cases I can see what they are, but in this one I can't. At least I don't know yet.
So let me just follow up on that. So do you see a difference between our knowing our own future free choices and them not entailing that our choices are necessary, but God knowing his own choices would entail that they are necessary?
Well, it's not a matter of knowledge. Again, as I see it, the problem is, are there truths about what I will in fact do? Because what it looks like Molina's saying is, yeah, it's no big deal that there are just a bunch of truths about what you will do. You still are free. God, though, before God makes any decision, any creative decision, it would be a problem if there were truths about what God will do. Notice I said will, because I think that it's also supposed to be a problem about would as well, but I'm focusing more on the will. So the future contingents on this one, because what it looks like is you've got this open future at the moment of natural knowledge for God, whereas that's because it would be a problem if there were these truths about what God will do prior to any decision.
Hey, we hope you're enjoying the conversation so far. Hey, please do us a favor. Check and see if you're subscribed. If you're not, a lot of you aren't, but if you're not, please subscribe, hit that notification bell. We'll get back to the episode in just a second, but we can only exist also because of viewers like you, people who support our channel. So you can go to freethinkingministries.com/donate and you can be a part of the team. We'd love to put you on our email list as well. Okay, now back to the conversation.
So even if there were these truths,
yeah,
a truth cannot cause something to happen or
Correct.
determine it to happen. So
yeah,
so a truth about God's future action is not what causes God's future action. So it would still be free and uncaused. God would be the source of it. But even if PAP, the principle of alternative possibilities, were unavailable, God still got sourcehood, and even we would have sourcehood, it seems to be. Even if God told us, hey, you are freely going to choose X instead of Y tomorrow.
You are freely going to deny me 3 times. Something like that.
Right. Okay, good. I feel some of the tension and the force that you're bringing up here, but at the same time, I want to say, well, it's still free in a libertarian sense, which is what we need for mere Molinism.
Sure.
But yeah,
I see your point. I guess because what my critiques are of Molina, and then this other critique that you want to look at that I have for Craig,
right?
Because Molina's sounds like he's really wanting PAP, because
right,
the entire idea of having these logical moments in the life of God, when John Duns Scotus like develops this, and when like Molina and others are like building off of this, that was the whole point of that entire metaphysical like story, is to give God this actual deliberation over different possibilities. So the whole point is to give God alternate possibilities. So I think if we just said sourcehood all day long and get rid of PAP, then I'd be like, ooh, okay, then why bother with all these logical moments and all this stuff?
I mean, okay, so can we say it like this? In that, I like how you, and I tried to discuss this a little bit in my book, but you say that time is an attribute of God.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think, and Dr. Craig normally says timeless sans creation. I think you two would both agree that God exists in what I have called a static state of affairs. And so that I would call that a static moment of time, to use your terminology, a static state in which nothing has ever happened or changed.
Yeah.
So sometimes I call that the Kalam state too, or use the Kalam cosmological
the initial segment of reality.
Yeah. So if we have that, and then dynamic time begins to exist and things start happening, changes start happening in ultimate reality. But in that static Kalam state, God knows everything. He's got the power that he's got the power to do. So in that sense, he's omnipotent. And just thinking about the different ways he could fine tune the initial conditions of the universe, with the fine tuning argument in mind. So God's got all these different options available that he has the power to do. There's nothing deterministically preventing him from doing otherwise. So even if it were true, and we're going to say, no, there's still a a proposition with a truth value that says God will create the universe that leads to this conversation right now, there was still nothing deterministically preventing him from the other options. And so in that sense, we could still say he had the power to do otherwise. Nothing stopped him. It was just true. But a truth, if it exists at all, is again abstract. But I mean, can't we don't even have to be committed to saying that they're, I mean, Tyson, how would Dr. Craig talk about that? He would just say, well, there's not these truths don't even exist.
Yeah, he doesn't see truths as things that exist in the external world. He sees the truth predicate as a way to talk about propositions. So you can just assert it's raining outside, right? But then you can talk about that proposition by saying it is true that it is raining outside, right? The truth predicate doesn't really add anything over and above, right? You just don't need it in order to assert something that is the case, right? So that's what Dr. Craig would say. He would just say, we don't need the truth predicate. Even God doesn't need the truth predicate. He can just know, all true propositions without needing propositions at all. And so you don't need the truth predicate because those are about affirming or saying something about the propositions.
So getting back to that static state, moment of time, where things aren't happening. God knows everything he could do given his power. That's his, I guess, natural knowledge. And then everything that would happen if that includes creating indeterministic worlds, then that's going to include middle knowledge. And then, okay, so then I just used temporal language there when I said and then.
Right. But that's how these logical moments are supposed to work. It's
right.
It's not a temporal and then. Trust me, it's a logical and then.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you see, I think you see where I'm going with this. Why don't you take it from there, Ryan? Yeah.
Well, yeah. So, so a few things, I guess, to point out what you're getting at, and before we jump into like the objection I have to Craig, because that's kind of the direction we're starting to push. So I think you're right. Determinism wouldn't be the problem. But I also think that determinism just doesn't apply to God, because determinism is usually like, well, given like the past laws of nature and like all this other stuff, like, this determines the outcome. Like, we're talking about God prior to creation. There are no laws of nature floating around. So like, so when some people are like, yeah, determinism applies to God, God has compatibilistic freedom, I'm like, that's just confused. Just stop it. But so yeah, I don't think that's the issue. The worry I have is more about fatalism. But but the way you're laying it out, you could just say, well, look, prior to God making a decision, he knows what he will do. He also knows right now he hasn't made that decision, but he knows that he will make this decision. He just hasn't made his decision yet. And that's fine. He's got free will because it's just sourcehood. We don't need like principle of alternate possibilities. And I think, okay, fine. That's coherent. That would get out of the objection I've raised. I just don't know what all the logical moments are doing anymore. I don't know why I would need the entire Molinist story of deliberating from the moment of natural knowledge to middle knowledge to free knowledge. Yeah, I guess that's the worry I would have here, which is bringing up an issue that I've not like explored in the podcast or anything. So I don't know if you guys really want to get into it, but yeah.
When I'm teaching Molinism, especially as to those who are new to it, talking about chronological moments doesn't make sense to them, right? When you're first exposed to this, right? And so I do try to ease them into those waters by just talking to, I teach the kalam first. And I even talk about this in my book and how the kalam is related and helps us think about this. But when you get back to that static kalam state, and then I ask the students, is God omniscient here? If so, God knows everything he has the power to do. And does God know everything that would happen if he were to create one way instead of another? And if that includes creating free creatures, then you have what's called middle knowledge. And they seem to get that pretty quickly. Now that is describing these logical moments without using that terminology. Do you think it makes sense to talk about it that way, or more sense maybe?
I think it's a good way to ease people into it, because that's one of the things I find attractive about Molinism. Is you've got this account of going, okay, I want to say God's really smart, and when God like makes a decision, he's not just like kind of just throwing stuff out there. Like, he's really got some thought process behind it, and he's considering his options. And so, he sits down and goes, well, if I did create a universe like this, how would that go? And so you've got a whole story you can tell to really ease people into this.
Yeah, right.
Then later on you can go, okay, well, then we introduce you to this machinery of logical moments. So I think pedagogically this is good, and it is trying to capture something that like Scotus and Molina and these others really were the concerns that they had. So I think this seems good to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously major differences between Ryan and like somebody like Dr. Craig or Molina in their affirmation of a timeless state, and so that's going to affect how you view the metaphysics of God's relationship to time, as well as His knowledge. So, Ryan, I can't remember. Do you affirm simultaneous causation?
No,
No.
I think it's just weird. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that. I'll just say I think it's weird. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's also, one of the outworkings of this difference is, if you think that simultaneous causation is coherent, then you're not going to have a problem with logical moments as well, because you see that, in the same instant, you can have both cause and effect. And, if for the logical moments, you're in this timeless state where one thing needs another in order to be true, but in this timeless dependence sort of way. And I think that's, if you think about a mathematical equation, for instance, 2 + 2 = 4. You don't need time in order for that to be true, I don't think. That's just a necessary truth that is, even if there was no time, that would be true. And there would still be an ordering to it, right? The 2 + 2 is needed in order to get the sum of 4. But that is timelessly true. That whole equation is true kind of all at once, if you will, in a timeless state. And so I think that's why, for me, I don't have a problem with the logical moments, because I think that, there can be a timeless hierarchical ordering of certain things, even in God's mind. Simultaneous causation, there is a cause and effect at a particular simultaneous moment. But obviously a cause is somehow hierarchically superior or prior to the effect, even though they're existing at the exact moment of that cause and effect relationship. So, yeah, that's all I would say about that, is that those deeper metaphysical issues will work out themselves in those differences on God and His relationship to time and His knowledge.
All right, I think we can move forward. I know we've solved the problem, I'm pretty sure. So we can now publish a paper, and everything will be fine, and there will be no problems with logical moments and God's knowledge of alternative possibilities. So obviously we've solved the problem, but let's introduce a new problem to solve. Yeah. This was where you said Dr. Craig's view of Molinism was, I think you said incoherent. He brought up two passages in his book where he talks about God doesn't deliberate, and then talks about God's kind of timeless deliberation, or something of that sort. Explain what the problem is, and then let's see if we can solve that problem too.
There's the surface level problem, and then there's like the deeper problem. So I'm looking at Systematic Philosophical Theology 2a, the Divine Attributes. And so this is page 255. Craig is quoting Molina and saying that God's act of will reflects, quote, an absolutely complete and unlimited deliberation. So like you get this like really awesome deliberation from God. And then he goes on, this is the same page here, 260. This is page 260. He says, God then deliberates which order he will instantiate. So like he deliberates about what universe he's going to create, including what decisions he will take and what decisions he would take under other circumstances, and freely chooses to create a certain world order. Finally, then, on the basis of his decision to create some world order, God knows every detail about that order. So what Craig is doing in this passage is just describing a really standard account of Molinism about divine deliberation. God's like, okay, what are the logical possibilities? okay, well, what are the metaphysical possibilities? Right? Okay, well, what if I do? Okay, well, let's think about. All right, now this is what I want to do. That's, you've got this story about divine deliberation. But then when you fast forward about 100 pages or so, that's when Craig starts saying, well, actually, because God is omniscient, God does not, literally does not deliberate. So let me see if I can find the direct quote here. Okay, so this is from page 331. So he says, an omniscient being cannot literally reflect and deliberate because he already knows the conclusion to be derived. So you got this like total like maximal deliberation. Oh yeah, but God actually can't deliberate. It's not possible. So this is just a surface level contradiction you've got. Totally deliberating, cannot possibly deliberate. The deeper worry here is when you start looking at the mechanics of the logical moments and what they're supposed to be doing. I don't know which one, if you want to go into that one or you want to just focus on the surface level one. Okay. So you've got this issue here about how does God have free will and how does he deliberate? And so like all of us are sitting down. So like Tyson's sitting. Can Tyson stand? You can be like, well, at the next moment he can stand. But right now he's sitting. He can't stand. It's too late. It's too late to do anything else. And John Duns Scotus is like, all right, look, I got this. I can tell you how Tyson really does have the ability to stand, even though he's already sitting. It's too late. So what I can do is embedded into a single moment of time are a series of logical moments. And they've got a very similar structure to temporal moments, but they're not temporal, I swear. As this is what Scotus is saying. And so he's like, this first moment, this first logical moment, Tyson is deliberating about whether or not to sit or stand. And at the next logical moment, like Tyson makes a decision to sit. And you're like, okay. And both of these things are embedded into a single timeless moment. And so then you apply this to God's timeless moment. So prior to any sort of like creative act in this one timeless state of affairs, you've got God at the moment of natural knowledge going, what are all the logical possibilities? I haven't even decided if I would like to create, let alone am I going to create. There just is no fact of the matter about what I'm going to do at the moment of natural knowledge. So I'm undecided and there is no fact about what I will do or what I would do. Now, at the moment of middle knowledge, God's deliberating about, if I did create, what would these creatures do? What would they do if I put them in different circumstances? So now God's deliberating. Then at the next logical moment, God makes a decision. This is what I will in fact do. And then you get all this free knowledge of like, now here's a story exactly how history is going to unfold. And all of this is happening in a single timeless moment, has no changes. So what you've got is God is undecided and God is decided about what to do. There is no fact of the matter about what God will do, and there is a fact of the matter about what God will do. And this is all taking place in a single logical moment. And so these are contradictions, undecided and decided. No fact about what I will do, definitely a fact about what I will do. And this is all supposed to be simultaneous in some kind of sense.
Yeah, a choice apart from time or deliberation apart from dynamic time.
Right.
Right. And so, I mean, but again, going back to, the states of affairs language. So imagine, being a maximally great being existing necessarily that's perfectly omniscient and omnipotent. Does it not make sense to say, okay, in that state of affairs, this maximally great being knows everything he's got the power to do and everything that would happen if he were to create one way or the other. And thus, say there's one out of all those options, there is one, happens to be one feasible, freedom permitting world in which evil is ultimately defeated and everyone who's not trans-world damned is saved. Wouldn't it follow that God, for lack of a better word, chooses that one, even though he's got the power to choose to refrain from creation or choose other worlds? But it seems like there's a way to describe that whole process. And maybe, I call it deliberation, and it seems like God does too, but it's not the way that we deliberate when we're inferring truth over moments, over dynamic moments. When we reach the inference of the best explanation, I think that's impossible for God to do. Last week when Tyson was on the show, I said, yeah, God's not rational in that sense. He doesn't rationally deliberate over time to infer best conclusions, but he is rational in the sense that he holds a perfect set of beliefs, none of which are contradictory. But again, in that static moment of time, or as what Dr. Craig would call the timeless state of affairs, it just seems, I don't feel a problem by saying, no, that a God who is omniscient and omnipotent knows his options, knows what he has the power to do, and knows the best world to create. What's the problem with calling that deliberation, as long as we're not saying, well, in a different kind of a way that humans deliberate?
Well, then we're just equivocating on the word deliberation, which is fine, but okay, well, actually, I don't think it's fine if we're equivocating, because if you're trying to do perfect being theologies, which seems to be like some of the motivation for Scotus to want to say God has this kind of robust account of freedom. Why? Because this freedom with the ability to do otherwise, that's what we see in creatures. That's the great making property. So God's got it. Well, what comes with that is deliberation. We've got it. So that must be the great making feature that God's got it. How do you get it? Well, here's the story to tell, logical moments. That's supposed to be the story. And if we're equivocating on the word deliberation there, well, then I can't make any inference that I see this great making property in me, therefore God's got it. So if we're equivocating, we're just changing the topic entirely. So
you think we need a different word?
Yeah, you need a different word. And then you also need now a justification for why you think God's got this, not deliberation, but like some liberation or something. Like, why should I think God has this,
But is there anything incoherent about the story I just told, though, about the maximally great being existing necessarily in that state of affairs prior to the first change, the first moment, God knowing everything he could do and knowing everything that would happen if he created one way instead of another?
There's nothing, it's not, it's sidestepping all of the contradictions that I'm bringing out, because you're getting rid of the machinery that generates the contradictions. So on those grounds, it would be coherent. There's other problems we could talk about, but for the sake of just like focusing on this one, it would just be saying, I'm just rejecting all that machinery, so this contradiction doesn't arise. But in rejecting all that machinery, now I'm going, there's Molinism, and like, I don't know how mere can the Molinism really be, because I've just gotten rid of all the logical moments. So I'm like, what am I doing?
Well, that's one reason why I do like and intentionally use the word mere Molinism. And in the mere Molinism Facebook group the other day, I got a kick out of what you said, how you like, Ryan Mullins' Molinism is greater than Luis de Molina's Molinism. And and I think there's, let's props and credit to Molina for starting this whole thing, but I don't think that we have to be committed to, well, Molina is infallible and got everything right here.
He's not the Pope. He's not the Pope, even if he was a Jesuit counter reformer. Let's kick it to Tyson for a second, and then we'll deliberate.
Yeah, well, first of all, Tim, never use the term "God is not rational" ever again. You just need to excise that from your memory.
I know you hate it.
Mind.
I know you hate it.
You sound like you sound like
almost have an aneurysm.
Yeah, you sound like Tyler McNabb. Like whenever he says God is not a thing, God is not a being. I'm like, dude, just
all right.
Just stop. Like nothing means anything anymore.
Yeah. I always try to clarify what I mean by that, but for you, Tyson, I'll try to
Tim, he likes to stir the pot as much as possible.
So one of the things I would say is one of the major issues here is one's view of divine cognition, right? How does God think? And that, I think, is going to have a huge impact on whether or not you think logical moments are plausible or coherent. So if you think that God must think that his cognition is discursive, that he has to think through things one step at a time in order to reach a conclusion, then of course you're going to find these sort of logical moments really problematic, because you don't have time in order for God to deliberate discursively. Right. But if you think that God's cognition isn't like that he kind of just necessarily has all of his knowledge at once, so to speak, in virtue of his being necessarily perfect and and necessarily omniscient, then you might find logical moments a little more plausible. And going back to what I said about, mathematical equations, those seem to be paradigmatic examples of truths that seem to have a logical ordering, that are, the whole thing is true even if there is no time. And certainly if God doesn't have to think through a mathematical equation, step by step in order to know that the whole thing is true, then I don't see any problem with there being this sort of logical ordering in his omniscience between natural, middle, and free knowledge. So I think that's probably a major gap between somebody like Dr. Craig and Ryan.
So I guess, okay, so at the moment of natural knowledge, God's knowledge is only supposed to be of like the necessary truths and truths of his own nature. And he doesn't know the future because there's just no facts about the future. But also at the moment of free knowledge, that's when he gets the foreknowledge. So there are truths about how things will go. And so from all eternity, in this single timeless moment, God doesn't know the future and God does know the future.
In that same state of affairs, right?
And so there's no facts about what will happen, and there are facts about what will happen. So this is where I think the analogy to the mathematical truths breaks down, because the idea is all these things need to be co-realizable. It's a way of saying simultaneous without saying simultaneous, because then you don't have to do all the time stuff. Because if God's supposed to be timeless and he's simultaneous with stuff, he's doing a really terrible job at being timeless. So the mathematical truths, like those are like co-realizable. 2 + 2 = 4. The 2 and the 2 and the 4, those are all co-realizable. No truths about the future and truths about the future, that can't be co-realizable. Not knowing the future and knowing the future, those can't be co-realizable. So I think this is where the disanalogy breaks down. And yeah, okay, I'll stop right there. I've got other thoughts.
So suppose someone would say because he's in that timeless state, there's no problem with those contradictions, because the time hasn't started yet. So there's no real problem. It only is a problem when time kicks in. Yeah.
At least dynamic time for the sake
so
of time.
It wouldn't be a problem that God knows and does not know.
Well, suppose I feel like some might think that, like, well, that could be something that would happen sans time, but once the decision's been made and time begins, you can't have those contradictions. But what you're saying is, well, but if we allow for that, then all contradictions could be true during that time. There could, right?
Well, kind of, yeah. So I've got this one paper called "Does Providence Entail Temporality?" Maybe. And I can't believe they let me get away with that title. But I developed this whole thought in a lot more rigorous detail than we can do in a podcast. But what I point out is you start piling up eternal contradictions into the life of God. And as a general rule of thumb, you shouldn't just pile up a bunch of eternal contradictions. So my solution is to say, well, just stop that with all this timeless stuff. Make those logical moments actual temporal moments. So the first moment of reality is God and just know his own nature. Mm-hmm. So he knows all the logical truths. He knows all the possibilities. And again,
that's a static state, right?
Yeah. Well, in all moments are static in a sense, because changes take place over a series of moments. Changes don't take place at a moment.
Prior to a first change.
Correct. Yes. Okay. So it's prior to any first change. The next moment would be the moment of middle knowledge. You'd be like, yeah. And now God is deliberating about, if I did create, what would happen? Mm-hmm. I kind of like that one. All right. So, and now at the next actual moment, now God's like, okay, this is what I'm going to be doing. Mm. And then now here's how the future is going to go. So you just get rid of all these things being actually together and contradicting. Yeah.
So if you were, this would be Mollinsism then.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Where you would get the benefit of libertarian freedom and middle knowledge, but you're just really trying to say no in the moment before the first change, this is how things are, and then God actually does deliberate.
Yes,
something.
So maybe that deliberation takes a fraction of a second, but it takes takes some time. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so this gets you. So basically, what I'm trying to point out is you've got a bunch of different problems in the way Molinas develop things. So you've got to make a decision. Do I want to go with Molina on everything, or do I want to try to fix the problems and maintain certain things? So one option could be just get rid of the ability to do otherwise. Another option could be no, I really want that divine deliberation, and I really want God to have the ability to do otherwise. So I'm going to keep these moments, get rid of the logical moments. They're just actual temporal moments. What Molina himself does, though, is he kind of waffles back and forth between this other issue, which is when I start talking about logical moments in the life of God, am I describing something that's real, that really maps onto divine reality, or am I just coming up with a useful fiction that only applies to just in my head alone? Molina waffles back and forth. Sometimes he's like, yeah, this is really there. And other times he's like, maybe not. And I'm like, which is it? And when I'm looking throughout history, there's a lot of people who waffle back and forth on this. Yeah. And I point this out in some of the different papers I've written. And I think Craig might be waffling back and forth on this in volume 2 of the Systematic. I'm not 100% certain because he uses some language that I don't know what you mean. But here's the problem if you make it just a fiction that exists in your own head. So I've identified this really serious problem about how can God have free will and deliberate and all that. And you're like, well, here's these logical moments. And you're like, oh, that's cool. Okay, you solved the problem. Do those logical moments actually describe anything in reality? Oh, no, of course not. Of course not. Well, then you just wasted my time. Fictions do not solve real world problems. So, you've got to, so I think that's why you have to make some kind of decision here to maintain something about Molinism is coherent or give up some other things about Molinism. I don't know. This is how I'm seeing it.
Yeah, well, I think Lord of the Rings did solve some real world problems, but
yeah, this is really interesting. I do think that going back.
Oh, you muted, I think.
You muted. I think your
or maybe knocked out a cord or something.
Maybe came unplugged or something. While Tim is muted, there we go.
All right.
While Tim is muted, Tim, hold on to that thought. I want to get Tyson's thoughts on some of this too, because I think if anyone knows Dr. Craig well, it would be Tyson in this group. So, what are some of your thoughts on what you've heard here?
Yeah. So one of the things that Ryan just mentioned is, if these logical moments aren't mapping onto anything in reality, then what are we even talking about? Are they useful fictions or what? And here I would also, I mentioned this in the last podcast we did, but here I think Dr. Craig's work on God and abstract objects is really, 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 really important. Because where he lands is that he doesn't think that, abstract objects exist. So there are no such things as propositions or sets or, properties or anything like that. But that doesn't prevent us, he says, from making true statements that quantify over those things. In other words, we can use those things in true statements without committing ourselves to them being real. So, I used the example last week. My walk this morning was refreshing. That might be a true statement, but that doesn't commit me to the reality of an object called a walk out there in reality, even though I've used it in a true statement. So similarly, Dr. Craig would say on, a neutralist theory of reference, on an anti-realist view of abstract objects, you can say, God has natural knowledge, God has middle knowledge, God has free knowledge. These are distinct logical moments without actually committing yourselves ontologically to there being this sort of concrete division in God's mind. Rather, these are just true descriptions of the contents of God's knowledge, right? So in that sense, I think you can have your cake and eat it too. It just requires you to accept Dr. Craig's view of theories of reference and how our language works.
Yeah, and that was basically what I was going to point to, is how, Tyson, you brought up the question is, how does God think? And so how would a maximally great being think? And prior to the first change, I think it makes sense to say again that he knows everything he could do and all that would happen if he were to create one way instead of another. And then as we describe that, and we're forced to describe that in temporal terms, we will use language like, well, he deliberated, but of course we mean something completely different by that. And maybe that's a problem, Ryan, if we're equivocating on that. But I think as long as we're careful to say, but look, a maximally great being does this differently, thinks thinks things through. Let's a lot of scare quotes here. Thinks things through differently than we do over time. But I think it's so important that you are bringing this up, and because this is what needs to be clarified. Now, with that said, I always love to push the boundaries here, and even if I wouldn't hold the view that you do, I still would say, well, I would call Molinism still a type of Molinism, where you're getting all these goods prior to creation. And so I actually, man, I encourage you to continue developing this, even if we are going to, even if I were to say, no, I don't hold to Molinism, but wow, I like it. let's look at it further. I think you're onto something very interesting here.
Yeah. That's good.
Can we call it Molinism, I guess?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's about a decade ago or so, Evan Fales, like I was doing this seminar on my first book, The End of the Timeless God, was like just working the manuscript, and this atheist philosopher Evan Fales was in the room, and he was like, so in 10 years from now, what is Molinism going to look like? And I was like, well, Molinism, I don't think is really going to change. He's like, no, your Molinism, what is that? And I'm like, oh Lord, I hope that like there's no such thing. Like, you know, like we don't need that.
Oh, well, maybe we do.
Would you call yourself, if push came to shove, do you label yourself? I mean, last week's podcast, or maybe it was a couple weeks, I can't remember. Somebody wrote in, this was a couple weeks ago now. And because I had talked about, you know, publishing this book, and that I had you look over certain segments of it. And they said, well, but isn't he an open theist? I'm like, no, I think he's a Molinist. And I guess I didn't even really know how to describe you. And others are saying, no, he's an open theist. Have you labeled yourself?
I lean towards Molinism. I've just got some different worries, some of which we've talked about here. But this like series of podcast episodes that like I was doing on divine providence that prompted all of this conversation today. The purpose of that was originally it was supposed to be for this PhD seminar I was teaching, where I was just introducing, here's all these things on providence, you know, here's some problems for and against, make up your own mind. Like that was the whole intent. So I don't really lay my cards on the table in any of those episodes because of that, those pedagogical reasons. But yeah, personally, I think something like Molinism might be true. I've just got worries. And so I'm trying to flesh out all of the different theories of providence so I can really understand what my options are.
Nice.
Molinism. So I got something to ask you about the difference in deliberation. And this might be a silly question, but it just popped into my mind. So if it is, let me know. So like we create as human beings, right? Like that's part of what we do. We create, we procreate, we can create art, we can do, but we have the inability to create like God creates. We can't create ex nihilo. That category does not exist to us. We can't do that. But we're not equivocating on the term creation or we create. If we say God creates, we create, and so God creates. Could deliberation be similar, where we deliberate because we're created beings and we've been created to think this way, but we don't deliberate like God deliberates? Is the creation still an equivocation, or is that a poor? Is that disanalogous?
Disanalogous. It might be. So here's two ways you could try to go with this. One is to say, look, there's the concept of creation and there are conceptions of creation. The concept of creation is that God freely and volitionally produces some cosmic stuff. And then you've got creation out of pre-existent material, like Gersonides does. Or you've got eternal creation, like Ibn Taymiyyah affirms. Or you've got creation out of nothing, like Augustine or Boethius affirm. And so these be conceptions. And so you could say like the concept of creation, the basic concept, that still applies. Like I produce a bunch of freely and volitionally produce a bunch of cosmic stuff. Yeah, or you could actually say there's actually within the medieval time period this stuff comes up where people say, no, actually I do create things out of nothing. You know, if any of you have kids, like there wasn't a person there and now there is. Woo. Or you're instantiating a bunch of tropes that weren't there before and now you are. These are examples actually given in like some of these medieval debates. With the case, so one way you could go to say, yeah, I could figure out where you're going at, and could I maybe do this with deliberation? Maybe. I don't think we can do this with deliberation, though, because deliberation really does mean you're weighing different options in some sort of torn state where you haven't made a decision, and then you weigh the options, and then you do make a decision. And so historically, when I'm looking at a lot of different theologians, in not just the Christian tradition, but within the Christian tradition, they'll just go, yeah, God doesn't deliberate. He just doesn't do that. He's got the power of rationality because he's always acting on the basis of reasons, but there's no deliberation because God's not in this torn situation and he's not thinking through the options or anything like that. So I don't know what you're wanting to get by keeping the language of deliberation if you're going to just say, yeah, God doesn't really find himself in this torn position. He's not really weighing options. So I think it'd just be cleaner to say, get rid of the deliberation entirely.
Okay.
Well, I think maybe a good takeaway for our viewers is this. If one does not feel that tension, then they're free to just hold to the standard way Molinists have always thought about it. If one is feeling that tension that you've got, Ryan, then you've offered a solution for the Molinist.
Yes.
They can still be mere Molinists in a pretty strong sense, I think. And so, so maybe the jury's still out. Maybe we need to keep having this conversation about deliberation and what that means. But really, I'm very pleased with this outcome because I think we've offered two different ways for the Molinists to think about this, and we can still be one big happy family.
I hope. I mean, I've tried to solve some problems for some open theists of going like, here's a way you can like get rid of all these problems with risk, God being too risky. Yeah. Some of them were like, Ryan, that was brilliant. Others were like, no, I hate it.
Oh yeah, I know.
and I've done the same thing with panentheism. I'm like, here's a way you could try to like make sense of your messy view. And some of them were like, that sounds great. Others were like, no, this is awful. So maybe I gave a nice solution that some Molinists will like, but will they be happy with it? Oof, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
Have you figured out what panentheism is yet?
No. I still have to publish on it.
But like, it was a Hunger Games sequel.
Pan-Am.
It could be. That was a good. That's good.
Yeah. Hey, thank you for your time. Just one question before we close here. Does your proposition does that solve the first issue with God's knowing truths or truths actually existing? Does that solve that as well, or is that still an open question?
No, not at all.
I think that's the question. Yeah.
It would. I don't think it makes the problem worse. I think it would just help people more clearly see the problem if you follow my view of just making God purely temporal all throughout. So it doesn't solve this problem. I don't know how to solve this problem at the moment.
Yeah. So that one we can still have more deliberations about. Thanks again for joining us, Ryan and Tyson. And any last words you guys wanted? It sounds like you're on an execution squad. Any departing words you want to give to our audience here, where they can find you and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm the global chapters director for Reasonable Faith. So if you're interested in getting involved in Christian apologetics, hit me up. And I'm also the president of Sound Faith Consulting. You can find everything about us at soundfaithconsulting.com or our Facebook page. We have some really exciting stuff coming out here in the next month or two. So highly encourage you to follow us on social media so you can stay updated.
And Sound Faith 2026 in Denver, right? Conference?
Yes, sir. Lots of big name people have already confirmed that they're going to be speaking at the conference. So can't wait to announce that.
And even some small name people.
Nah, we're not going to allow small name people this time.
So for me, you can go to rtmullins.com and you can find a lot of my papers I've made freely available. Not all of them, because I'm coming up on 80 papers that are published now. But I've got a lot of them up there. I've also got my book From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker, which is published through Routledge. But the University of Helsinki they paid all the open access fees for that. So you can actually download the digital copy for free instead of paying like $150 for the hard copy, which is just absurd. But yeah, you can download that for free and see some of these issues laid out. And then if you want, in November, when we're at the Evangelical Philosophical Society, I'm going to be on a panel discussion discussing Craig's Systematic Philosophical Theology, Volume 2A. And I'm going to be bringing up a bunch of these issues. So if you want to see how Craig responds, I don't know, just come to Denver in November and we'll see it. I don't know what he's going to say. So we'll find out.
Sounds great.
Well, that'll be fun.
Awesome. We'll be there. All right. Thank you guys for joining us. Hey, if you like this conversation and you're watching, make sure you hit the like button. Go follow Ryan and Tyson where you can follow them. Make sure you subscribe to their podcast. Subscribe to ours as well, and share this podcast with somebody who is an open theist. Let's get as many people upset as possible. That drives up the algorithm. So we're going to do that. And if you've got any questions, because a lot of deep topics were talked about today. If you have any questions, hey, go to freethinkingministries.com. Click on the contact us, ask us the questions, and we'll do our best to tackle them at a later date. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and I'm sure we can get these guys back to do a round 2.
Absolutely. So please do that. freethinkingministries.com, contact, and we would love to do that. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for watching. And as we always say here at Free Thinking Ministries,
stay reasonable.
Stay reasonable.